Due to having lived for 14,000 years, the man before them had to move homes every 10 years. Some of the friends who came to see him off were puzzled, not understanding why John would suddenly give up being a Harvard history professor for the past 10 years. Had he encountered difficulties? John could only fabricate a story, claiming he suffered from cabin fever, necessitating a relocation every so often. At this moment, a woman was astonished to discover a genuine painting resembling Van Gogh on the ground. John explained that it was a gift from an old friend and casually placed it in his car. What authors didn't know was that the friend John mentioned was actually Vincent van Gogh himself. The people who came to bid farewell were scholars and professors from various fields. They couldn't believe that John, at such a young age, had been afflicted with such an illness, even giving up a promising future and stable income. Speaking of age, a female professor suddenly remarked that John showed no signs of aging over the past 10 years. This was a secret every woman wanted to know. Though it was a joke, it added a lively touch to the atmosphere as the people were about to part ways. Just then, an anthropologist discovered a parrot-style stack on the table. It seemed to be a product from the pre-Magdalenian era, the Old Stone Age in Europe. An archaeologist hurriedly examined it, and after repeated observations, confirmed that it indeed belonged to the Old Stone Age. The Magdalenian era's final civilization belonged to the Cro-Magnon people, yet historical records made no mention of them making or using such stone tools. Hence, this was a very important archaeological specimen. Anthropologist Lao He asked John where he got this thing from. John casually explained that he picked it up for $2 at an antique store. This offhand remark made everyone envious since the item's worth was immeasurable. Seeing that John remained indifferent, the others couldn't help but inquire about where he was moving to, and why he had suddenly made this decision. John hesitated to speak, but the more he did, the more curious the others became. Finally, amidst incessant questioning, John suddenly turned the tables and asked the others a question. What would someone look like if they had survived from the Old Stone Age until today? Lao He initially thought John was about to write a science fiction novel and became interested. He began by analyzing from an anatomical perspective, suggesting that if this person had truly lived until now, their body should not differ much from a normal person. However, the female professor disagreed, speculating that due to a life of seclusion and study, this person might resemble a savage. Lao He disagreed with this notion, assuming this individual had lived for 140 centuries, possessed normal intelligence, and a curiosity for knowledge. He could envision them undergoing self-transformation with the changing times. While their initial knowledge might be limited, over time, this person's expertise would become extensive and astonishing. Returning to the prospect of John writing this science fiction story, he was confident that there would be some anthropological mistakes within, hoping that John would consult with Lao He extensively during the writing process. As the discussion progressed, someone inquired about how this person would survive until now. The biologist chimed in, stating that from a biological standpoint, this person should possess perfect regenerative abilities in their body's cells, especially in critical organs. Typically, humans could live up to around 190 years, but most succumb to slow poisoning. The entire metabolic process in the human body took 7 days, and although unstable, the accumulation of waste ultimately led to organ failure. In the scenario of this science fiction story, if the person had a unique immune system capable of perfect detoxification and regeneration, they could indeed evade aging and achieve immortality. The biologist found himself entertaining the notion that this possibility might actually be achievable in reality. After all, what was once considered magic in ancient times had become reality today. For instance, the discovery of Columbus's New World, or Copernicus's heliocentric theory, before these breakthroughs, weren't their proponents often labeled as madmen or charlatans? At this point, John refuted the biologist, mentioning that the heliocentric theory was initially proposed by Aristarchus. Regarding Columbus, John suddenly shared that he had the opportunity to embark on a voyage with him. While he believed the Earth was round, he did express concerns that Columbus might fall off the edge at some point. This revelation left everyone with incredulous stares. Weren't they discussing science fiction? How could John claim to have met Columbus? Many thought he was joking, but John asserted seriously that he was, in fact, the Cro-Magnon man who had lived for 14,000 years. Chuckling, John proceeded to perform a primitive roar, successfully eliciting laughter from the crowd and confirming that he was indeed joking. However, John continued, explaining that the reason he moved every 10 years was the fear that people would discover he doesn't age, forcing him to relocate. John's narrative became increasingly absurd, leaving the audience uncertain if he was joking or genuinely immersed in his tale. In response, they asked how he confirmed his origin from the Paleolithic era. John admitted he wasn't entirely certain, but based his conjecture on archaeological maps, anthropological research, and memories from the Mesopotamian period. He emphasized that his assumptions were the closest approximation based on contemporary data, essentially recalling scenes from his past. He then described the extensive story of his long life. In the first phase of his existence, he ceased aging at 35, and the tribe initially revered him, believing he possessed magical powers. Over time, suspicions grew, suggesting John might be extending his life by stealing others' longevity. Fearing this, the tribe eventually expelled him. From then on, John lived through a cycle of tribal exiles. During this period, he learned how to integrate into new tribes and when to depart regularly. Since societies were semi-nomadic at the time, migrating with climate and prey, John's presence wasn't conspicuous. As the weather gradually became colder, indicating the onset of the post-glacial period, John speculated about the era. When asked about the landscape, John described towering mountains and recalled glimpsing the British Isles from the present-day French coast. The vast mountain ranges stood across a seemingly bottomless gorge until the glaciers melted, separating these mountains from the mainland as sea levels rose. The biologist questioned if this was true, and Oldman confirmed that it aligned with historical records. The archaeologist added that this information was indeed present in textbooks, and John affirmed that he recollected these details based on the data in the books. For instance, normal people often forget some childhood memories, let alone scenes from such distant experiences. However, when these images suddenly appear in the records, he gradually recalls those ancient memories. Just after saying this, the biologist raised another doubt, suggesting the possibility of reincarnation, as if memories of past lives were acquired through cycles of life and death. However, John clearly stated that life only happens once. The female scholar then asked, "If that's the case, aren't you curious about the origin of the world?" This question seemed to touch John's inner thoughts, and he explained that initially, he also believed there must be gods in the heavens. He understood that what happened to him was abnormal and even thought he might be cursed. However, over time, he gradually realized that perhaps all of this happened coincidentally to him. Thus, he transformed into an atheist. While these words sounded absurd, the logic presented by John was flawless, leaving the others unable to counter-argue. At this point, the female professor casually inquired about the painting by Van Gogh in the car. Initially thinking it was a fake, she was surprised to hear John say that, at that time, his name was Bone, and he was a pig farmer. Van Gogh often visited him to paint, and over time they became friends, frequently discussing how to capture nature in art. After Van Gogh's death, precisely when it was time for John to move on, he immigrated from France to the United States to continue living. The archaeologist raised another question at this point, asking why John, who possessed the secret of immortality, was now revealing all this to them. John pondered for a moment and said it was a spontaneous idea, maybe not a good one. But he wanted to bid farewell to everyone with his true identity. This statement made the archaeologist suddenly realize that John might not be joking. If that was the case, there might indeed be some issue with John's mental state. So, he went into the next room and called his friend, the psychologist. At the same time, anthropologist Lao He asked John if, amidst the vast river of ancient history, he hadn't preserved some antiques as witnesses of his life. John countered by asking Lao He why he should preserve them. In the era he referred to, he had no concept of origins, comparing it to the pen he held. Would he carry it 1,000 years later? No, he would surely lose it. Therefore, in the ancient times, how could he know that a random piece of stone would hold such value? This response left Lao He unable to counter, and indeed, the dagger he held was something John picked out from an antique store. As John loaded his luggage into the car, the young female professor expressed her affection for him. She revealed that she had fallen in love with John since his first week at the school. While John admitted to having feelings for her, he explained that similar events had occurred many times in the vast history of his life. He had witnessed his wife and children slowly aging, and every decade, he had to choose to leave them behind. Therefore, John didn't want to hinder the young professor. Later, the two returned to the house, and the others bombarded them with more questions, still incredulous that John could weave such a flawless narrative. This time, John began recounting his experiences as he traveled eastward. Once aware of his uniqueness, he became increasingly curious about the world, slowly venturing towards the rising sun. It was his first time seeing the ocean, near what is now the Mediterranean. Following the coastline, he reached the east, witnessing the spectacular Bronze Age. Continuing along the eastern trade routes, he encountered numerous wonders of creation. Learning their languages, he gradually realized that his aimless wandering was meaningless. He chose to stay, becoming a Sumerian for 2,000 years, part of the Babylonians under the Hammurabi Code. Due to his immortality, he had to continue heading east. This time, he arrived in India, coinciding with the era of Buddha. It was the most extraordinary person he had encountered, and Buddha taught John many things. Consequently, John stayed, becoming a disciple of Buddha. Although Buddha might have sensed John's uniqueness, he never inquired about John's secret. As John finished recounting these tales, everyone was left in a state of shock. They couldn't discern whether this was a story, or John's true intentions. Lao He leaned towards the story, while the archaeologist believed John's mental state was compromised. Coincidentally, a car arrived outside, the mental health specialist summoned by the archaeologist. Given the peculiar circumstances, nobody could prove or disprove John's statements. Even with the arrival of the mental health specialist, they needed John to continue his narrative, hoping that he might reveal a flaw in his storytelling sooner or later. After understanding the situation, the mental health specialist directly asked John if, having lived for so long, he had never suffered from a serious illness. John mentioned vaguely remembering having pneumonia twice in prehistoric times. However, in recent centuries he had contracted typhoid, yellow fever, and smallpox. Remarkably, he survived the Black Death as well. Yet due to the uniqueness of his body, he bore no scars from any of these illnesses. The biologist was shocked upon hearing this and strongly insisted that John visit his laboratory for further examination. However, John outright refused. He didn't want to be imprisoned and treated like a lab rat. At this point, everyone faced a dilemma. John, despite sharing an astonishing story, seemed indifferent to whether they believed him or not. Lao He asked John, "Since you've lived for so long, you must have learned a lot, right?" John nodded, stating that he had 10 degrees, covering any field present in the room. Except for psychology, which he hadn't extensively studied, he couldn't surpass the most exceptional minds, no matter how hard he tried. All he could do was slowly learn what others had researched. In essence, living for 14,000 years didn't make him a genius. He just had a lot of time to study. As John continued his narrative, everyone found themselves once again at a loss against his formidable logic. The mental health specialist couldn't sit still anymore. All the premises were set to test if John was lying. Pretending to pull out a weapon, he aimed it at John, questioning if John could be killed. John answered affirmatively, clarifying that he didn't possess immortality. He survived purely by chance all these years. If hit, he would undoubtedly die. The mental health specialist, satisfied with the response, pulled out his pipe, revealing that it was all just a test. The others, seeing the pipe, also breathed a sigh of relief. The mental health specialist then asked John about his perspective on the cycle of life and death. John felt it was chaotic, likening it to meeting someone, learning their name, and then they pass away before you truly get to know them. It felt like waves, coming and going. With time, he would slowly forget them. Although some were family and friends, he was helpless. All he could do was distance himself from them before they discovered his secret. The psychologist suddenly asked John if he ever had a moment where he felt the person who died was himself. After a brief silence, John replied with a, "Maybe." Surprisingly, this response excited the psychologist. He questioned whether John had ever suspected that he might be unknowingly stealing others' lives to survive. The psychologist suggested that John might be unaware of it. He expressed his frustration, claiming that if John insisted on being ageless, he could as well be considered a legendary vampire. To test this theory, the psychologist pulled out a real handgun. If shooting John resulted in self-healing, he would believe John's claims. This action made everyone nervous. They were just discussing a story. There was no need to take it literally. Fortunately, the psychologist didn't actually shoot. He eventually holstered the weapon and left. The biologist informed John that the psychologist couldn't accept his story because his wife had recently passed away. Concerned, John went after him, persuading him to hand over the weapon. When they opened the magazine, they discovered it was empty. Back inside the house, John intended to conclude the conversation. However, the others were now fully intrigued and determined to uncover the truth. They questioned John about encounters with other immortals. John revealed meeting another immortal in the 17th century. They conversed for 2 days but couldn't confirm each other's authenticity. Suspecting deception, they parted ways. Surprisingly, 200 years later in Brussels, John encountered the same person at a train station. but the individual quickly vanished into the crowd. The biologist casually asked about John's leisure activities. John mentioned visiting a primitive tribe in New Guinea, where people worshipped him as an immortal god, even erecting a giant statue in his honor. When asked about his beliefs, John stated that he once had his own beliefs, similar to contemporary people. But now he believes in nothing. Lao He questioned him about meeting historical figures from religious texts, like those in the Bible. Initially hesitant to answer, John's reluctance only fueled their curiosity. The archaeologist even speculated that John might be a biblical figure, while the female scholar wondered if he was one of the 12 apostles. John clarified that they were not true apostles, and hadn't participated in any genuine transmission. The archaeologist questioned John about how he knew all of this. John looked a bit awkward and said that myths are simply intricate stories passed down among people, and the reality is quite simple. The original New Testament, he added, was actually less than 100 words. This statement had a profound impact, especially on the devout Christian professor nearby. Following this, John's words once again challenged her worldview. He began to narrate his experiences 500 years after studying under Buddha, when he returned to the Mediterranean. This time, he transformed into an Etruscan. Later, he clandestinely infiltrated ancient Rome, which was rampant with bloodshed. He started spreading the teachings of Buddha in a modern form, facing opposition from the Roman authorities. The truth was about to be revealed. John was none other than Jesus from Christian mythology, mixed with numerous myths over time. Lao He raised doubts about the crucifixion, questioning how it happened. John explained that he learned in the East how to slow down the body's aging process. Using this method, he successfully feigned death and deceived everyone. When the followers took him down from the cross and buried him in a cave, he gradually recovered to normal life. However, unexpectedly, he was discovered when preparing to leave quietly, leading to the mythical story of Jesus' resurrection. After this revelation, everyone's perspectives were thoroughly shaken. Who would have thought that the Savior was, in fact, a caveman? John continued, discussing how priests later propagated the concepts of heaven and hell, manipulating people's thoughts with temptation and fear, a stark contrast to his original intentions. At this point, the professor, a devout believer in God, was on the verge of collapse, unable to accept the narratives presented by John. Just then, the psychologist suddenly returned, realizing he had gone too far before, and came back to apologize to John. However, to his surprise, in the short time he was away, John had transformed into Jesus. This surreal story momentarily led the psychologist to consider whether John might be mentally disturbed. As the night grew deeper, it became apparent that staying any longer wouldn't yield the answers the individuals sought. Faced with the unsettled minds of the group, the psychologist suddenly addressed John, stating, "While I don't believe you're truly insane, you must admit that this is an absurd story. Otherwise, I'll be forced to have you committed to a mental hospital." John initially remained silent for a moment. Then, amidst the expectant expressions of the others, he declared that all of this was just a story. He thanked everyone for inspiring him and explained that he had concocted such an absurd tale. This statement seemed to empower the group, for even though they couldn't refute what John narrated, they hoped it was all fiction. Now that John had acknowledged this, the group finally found relief. With that, there was no need to linger any further, and they began to bid farewell to each other. Before departing, the female scholar pointed out the name, John Odman, suggesting it might be a play on words. Odman seemed to correspond to an old man. Subsequently, others started leaving one by one. However, the young female professor remained skeptical about John deceiving everyone. Though she didn't want to pry too much, she expressed interest in John Odman's play on words, and asked if he had any other names with double meanings. John casually mentioned a few, such as John Pelly representing the old-timer era, John Savage denoting a wild man, and John Patty being a name he used 60 years ago while teaching in Boston. Surprisingly, this statement happened to catch the attention of the psychologist. It turns out the psychologist was John's child, but the overwhelming shock rendered him unable to accept the truth. Subsequently, the immense stress triggered a heart attack, leading to his unfortunate departure from this world. John watched his child pass away before him with wide-open eyes. He displayed no signs of grief, perhaps indicating that he had become numb to emotions over time. After arranging everything, John prepared to leave in his car. However, just before departing, he stopped the vehicle. Perhaps, in the end, he was willing to give the young professor one last chance to make a choice. As the young professor walked slowly towards the car, the story essentially comes to an end. Despite being a low-budget film from 2007, the narrative structure is on par with any high-budget production. While the first viewing might feel somewhat dull, repeated watchings reveal the richness in every line of dialogue. The entire movie delves into whether John is truly a person who has lived for 14,000 years. Although John recounted every detail, he couldn't prove the truth of his words, and the others couldn't disprove them. Hence, the truth ultimately led to endless speculation. Reflecting on it, during this extended period, it seems like we, much like those professors and scholars, have become ensnared in an unsolvable mystery. Only at the very end do we finally get the answers we've been seeking. The film, titled The Man from Earth, is a highly recommended piece. I encourage everyone to watch it. Subscribe for more videos like this, turn on notification and leave a like. Thanks for watching.